Welcome to Preparing for the Unexpected. Today, I'd like to talk about an article that was recently posted on CNN.com by Sean Lungas. I'm hoping saying that right. That actually talked about no cyber team protection uh, being implemented for upcoming US elections. And you will know from my guest, we've kind of touched on that a bit now and then over the last 6 to 12 months. So I'd like to welcome back Regina Phelps. Regina, welcome back.
Alex, it's been so long. It's good to see you, my friend.
Yes, you too. It's like we're talking almost weekly now. There's so many things going on.
So many things going on, and you have this new format, which makes it even more interesting to drop stuff in. So
Yes.
kudos to
Yeah.
you for your timing.
Oh, thank you. Well, like I said, when I saw this one about a cyber teams, elections, and being on the lookout for all this stuff, I thought, well, who better to talk to about that than Regina? Because we've touched on some of this before, right?
Right, we have certainly. Yeah, it's very timely, and yeah, there's a lot going on about elections in the United States.
So why don't we get started? Why do we need a cyber team for elections? Let's just ask something simple like that.
Okay, before we do that though, I want to set the context for election law in the United States because if Canadians or other people may not be aware of this, and I pulled out some material just to be able to make sure I'm correct. So the US Constitution has the rules for elections actually included in there, and it's actually gives both states and Congress responsibility for regulating federal elections, and it's actually in the Constitution under Article 1, Section 4. And it says there that the federal government nor the president has any authority over elections, and that it's actually the responsibilities of the state. So, why I just want to mention that straight away is that there's been occasions where President Trump has talked about this or that in relationship to either trying to manage or control somehow how the elections are administered. And just so everybody knows, in the United States, anyway, the US Constitution basically says that the state is responsible for guaranteeing the regular occurrence of elections and protecting the right of all eligible citizens to participate. So that just sort of sets the tone that the federal government is not responsible for elections in this country. It's only the states.
So does that mean, based on this article, there would be 50 different cyber teams for
No,
every
there's
state?
actually a federal team that looks overall at both the equipment that is purchased by at the state level. They oversee and really monitor the kind of traffic that's going back and forth between our country and other nations around the world. And there was a lot of that during our elections in 2020 and 2024, 26. And so it just gives you a sense that they want to be monitoring both what people are saying, what's happening electronically. So they have a responsibility to basically do overall surveillance, but not to administer, which means, people at the polling stations, the machines they would use, all of those different things. It's not done by the feds, it's done by the state, but the feds do a really effective job of monitoring what's happening in the world of cyber security and elections.
Well, that's the crux of this article. That cyber team at the federal level has not been activated yet. So
And
what
I
would
would,
that mean?
yeah, it's not good. Then I think the next sort of way to look at that is sort of the next level about elections, and that's looking at foreign influence versus foreign interference.
What's the
So
difference?
yeah, it's a great question. So, and I made sure I was correct on printing this out here so I could be accurate. So essentially, if you look back at the 2020 election, there was a lot of conversation about foreign interference. And that's not the right term. The Russians and Iranians, who were the two people that were doing the most meddling, I suppose you could say, in elections, weren't meddling with the actual election per se, but they were influencing. So there's a difference between essentially interfering, meaning that you're tampering in some way with equipment or processes or things like that. So you're in there kind of messing around versus influence. And so influence would be things such as, creating chat bots that could be putting out all kinds of stuff on all kinds of social media as an example, or doing AI photographs that are, oh my God, did you see? And it's not real, of course. And
Mm.
so that kind of ability to change people's minds is the influence. And you can bet, especially with AI right now, you can bet that there's going to be a lot of influence from foreign actors. And you'll see them on Facebook and Instagram and many other platforms. And people will see them and go like, "Oh my God, did you see that? I got to send it to
Mhm.
Alex." And then what's going to happen, because when you see something or you read something, so it's an image or some conversation about what you did, you, the political party, or the person running, people have a tendency to basically, oh my gosh, and they hit send. And so I send it to you or I post it. And so that's where we get into the misinformation, disinformation campaigns. And, there are many people that just see something and they get agitated and they think, I got to do something. And then they send it on to somebody else. And so that's another sort of part, right? I mean, the foreign influence gets it out there, but then we then, promulgate it.
Yeah. Yeah. I was actually in the dog park. I know I've said this so many times in the dog park today.
Yeah, I know you're in the dog park.
Yeah. And we actually had to talk about some of this stuff. And almost everyone in the park said it's getting harder and harder to distinguish
Yes,
what's real and what's not real. Some of
right.
it blatantly obvious, but some of it
And fingers
is
instead of five.
questionable. Like, I'm not
Yeah,
quite sure about that.
right.
Luckily, everyone follows up. But with regards to this, with the elections, what can local government or state governments, I guess it would be in this, what can they do or communities do that are running these elections if the ones who are supposed to be overseeing this whole thing, the monitoring and what the traffic and things like that isn't in
Mhm.
place? Well,
Right.
wouldn't that make it easier then to get through to local elections or state elections and actually influence?
Yes. Yes. The influence is going to be extreme, starting in the midterms in the United States, but also in the next presidential election. So I think what's going to happen if the feds don't stand up, and usually the election team, it's called ESG, they actually are activated months before the election because they're monitoring all of this stuff, right? They want to know what's
Hmm.
going on. And so if they haven't been activated yet, oh my God, they may not get activated. Maybe Trump's not going to activate them, or he's told them to stand down. We don't know. But I think what that means is that think about the amount of just compute power, the cyber professionals, all of those individuals that are at the federal level, playing bingo, I don't know, just sort of doing nothing, I guess. But their task is to literally be observing and watching what's happening both in influence and interference, which would be the actual tampering. Now, if they're not doing that and they don't do it before these elections, what does that mean? Well, ask yourself the question, and looking at Canada, could the provincial governments pick that up at in the, Saskatchewan or, Alberta, they don't have necessarily probably the resources. The same thing in the United States.
Hmm.
The bigger states would have very likely to be able to put some muscle behind that, but small states here in the United States aren't going to have the resources to do that. And so, especially some of the big swing states that where they could determine some of the elections, I could bet that there'd be a lot of energy focused on those states. And if they're not doing it at the federal level, who's going to fund that activity at the state or the local level? And the answer is probably going to be no one. And so then what happens?
Yeah.
And then I think what you'd have to consider is that there's actually a group here in the United States called the Legal Defense Fund. And I'll send you some links to some of this because they have a variety of things to talk about, not so much the electronic aspect of influencing, but really the issues related to voter intimidation. Because the second part of the voting concern is that not only will we have potentially interference, certainly influence, but then when people go to the polls, there's a concern that in some communities, there'll be people there, which you can congregate outside a poll, and they'll be there to intimidate somebody from actually voting. And that's a huge concern in many areas of the United States. So the Legal Defense Fund just put out an entire toolkit that's called Community-Based Strategies for Preventing Voter Intimidation. Because the concern is going to be that when the polls open, the lines form, there'll be other people out there that will maybe not say anything, maybe not do anything, but will be standing there just
Watching.
watching and potentially freaking people out, especially if they don't have white skin.
Hmm.
Because you can think of a Hispanic person, somebody that looks like they're, foreign born perhaps, or just they're not white. That's the key thing, that they're going to be likely intimidated. And that's going to be a huge issue.
So for local governments or state governments, like they really have, and people within those jurisdictions have to become more cyber aware, I guess,
Yeah.
as to identifying what's real and what's not real, and looking at multiple sources and not just seeing something that Regina sent me. Well, because Regina sent it to me, it must be true.
Right. And then you
Or
hit forward.
Alex sent something, so it must be true, right? And we have to become more self-aware.
Right. And that's actually, and that's just good cyber hygiene anyway for any of us. But again, because we're busy, blah, 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 we see some really interesting photo or we see some really crazy story. We think, oh, this is, I got to send this on. And so what happens is that influence is basically they sort of know your interests, if you will, and they feed them up. Or maybe you're experimenting and you're just dropping into chat groups online, or maybe a Facebook group or somebody like that. And the next thing you know, you sort of get identified and they start serving you up stuff. And it's a way that you can convert people to your side, whatever side that is. And I think that's the bigger concern I think I have. The other part is that Trump initially has been still trying to find ways to actually do something about the elections, even though the federal government has no role. He's trying to somehow make some legislation that will pass, but so far nothing has actually stuck. So I think that's another concern that is going to happen as we go forward. But the fact that the ESG committee has not been, the electronic or the election security group has not been stood up out of the CISA group is really unnerving to me.
Yeah, it is. It's no offense to my American friends, but it almost sounds as though it's a third world dictatorship running this election.
Yeah. Yeah, I just sat through a really interesting podcast yesterday on The Economist, and they were talking about essentially the health of democracy around the world. And they were talking about it's a democracy index that they put out annually. And so the United States has continued to fall, and we're not quite a hybrid government anymore, meaning kind of half, democratic and half kind of dictatorial. But they were beginning to call us we're getting our feet towards the hybrid model, which is, yes, we have some democracy, but we also have this dictatorship.
Yeah. Because if I heard about it from some of the dictatorships in Africa or Southeast Asia, some of these other places that have a dictatorship, I wouldn't bat an eye.
Right,
I'd almost expect it.
right.
I'm a little concerned myself as to what might happen in I think they're in November, right? The next round
Yes,
of
November. Right.
November. Uh, it, without a cyber team and what I'm going to see show up through all of my feeds all of a sudden as
Hmm.
well.
Hmm.
Oh my goodness. You know,
Right.
uh, well, we're coming to the end. Do you have anything final thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, what I really like people to think about is to and this is tying it back to our profession and what we do for a living. But again, this idea of really understanding cyber awareness, really understanding about how to discern between mis and disinformation. Misinformation is just sort of a, kind of a fib, if you will, right? Where the disinformation is the blatant lie. But what happens is that we see this not only in elections, but we see this in a variety of news stories whenever there's something that occurs anywhere in the world, like a war or something like that, supply chain disruptions. You begin to see where there's real stories and there's not real stories. And so I would just say to all of the people that ever listen to us, they need to spend some time really on working through and parsing through mis and disinformation. And that means that they need to really step back, resist sending things on,
Yeah.
look it up, triangulate it the best they can. And that means that maybe you're not posting a bunch of stuff. That's okay. Or you're not sending it on to your boss. But what you need to do is you need to spend that extra time. Because what will happen to our profession is if we fall into all those rabbit holes, what's going to happen is that really defers away from our credibility. And we have to be kind of a broker of the truth. And so whether it's your personal life I'm talking about, but also your professional life, because it's going to bleed over. So
Yeah.
really work on mis and disinformation and making sure that you're actually validating things before you pass it on.
I think that's a perfect way to end, but I actually do want to share something that happened today
Ooh.
based on what you were just talking about. I was on Facebook and there was a posting about Phil Collins. I'm sure you know the singer Phil Collins,
Yep.
and that he was doing a new tour during 2026 and he looked healthy. And there were 14,000 likes and comments saying, this will be great and it's wonderful. Well, Phil Collins is in a wheelchair basically. He cannot play drums. He cannot walk
Right.
around.
Right.
We saw him in his final show with Genesis, and yet 14,000 people believe this. And I
Right.
was scratching my head going, come on. How
Right.
can you believe this? This is blatantly wrong information.
And but that's a perfect example. People went like, oh, yeah,
Yeah,
that's going to happen with politics galore all the way, at least in the United States, up to the midterms. And it's already started.
yeah. Regina, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I always appreciate it.
You're welcome, Alex. It's so much fun talking to you. And we do it a lot more often these days.
Yes, we do. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot more.
Yes, I'm sure. Thanks a lot. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Thanks.